just as people are coming in, I'll begin to be saying that we bring very enthusiastic and warm greetings from our colleagues and many partners in Scotland, and to all of you here in the room and all of the viewers that are joining us, we bring you a great big hello. Scotland has been actively seeking to strengthen the social services workforce in earnest, really, for some time, but particularly since Scotland gained some legislative powers around this area in 2000 and has put in significant resource and shown some long-term commitment in its efforts to improve the outcomes of children. But it's still not enough. There's still far to go, but there's lots of learning that we're building on, and we're thrilled to be sharing some of that learning with you today. Joining me on the platform today is Iona Colvin, who is the Scottish Government's Chief Social Work Advisor, who brings a wealth of experience and a fantastic fresh perspective on a new vision and a direction for Scotland's social services in the context of the challenges and the opportunities of our changing landscape. And also joining us today is Dr. Ian Milligan, who is the International Advisor at CELSIS, which is a Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children, which is a centre that seeks to bring evidence into practice and supports practice and policy change. And among many international projects that Ian's been involved with, you may be familiar with the Workforce Strengthening Implementation Handbook of the UN Guidelines for Alternative Care, and the Tracking Progress Monitoring tool that you'll be hearing about later today, and other things such as the massive open online course on the UN guidelines. I'm the Executive Director of CELSIS. I'm Jennifer Davidson, and I also lead a new Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures, which is building on CELSIS as a founding core centre. And Inspiring Children's Futures brings together many applied centres within the University of Strathclyde and well beyond our borders, with the aim of working with you collectively and internationally to improve the outcomes for children and young people who are facing adversity. Excuse me. A little bit of context for you about Scotland before we dive in and begin to hear from Iona. I think when you think Scotland, I'm keen to know some of the stereotypes that might jump, or images, not stereotypes, images you might want to jump into your mind. So I'm thinking perhaps you're imagining bagpipes or tartan. Maybe you're imagining gorgeous rolling hills and incredible views of the sea. Perhaps you're even thinking whiskey, I'm not sure. I'd like to just add one more image in your mind of what you might be thinking about here. So we too have some exotic animals in Scotland. This is not made up. These are our Highland cows, and they look very prehistoric, don't they? So this is to entice you to visit us, because we would love to have you visit us in Scotland. And of course, you know that my biggest fear now is the one thing you're going to remember about the Scotland presentation are the Highland cows. So now we've got something to try and improve on. So I might just give you a little bit of more relevant facts, perhaps, to our presentation, to our context of Scotland today. Just very briefly, the Scottish population is about 5.3 million. It's the highest it's ever been, and of that, about 8.5%. Scotland's population is 5.3, and it is about 8.5% of the UK population, which is 63 million. The number of children under 18 is just over 1 million, and the number of children who are what we call looked after, and our legislation for children who are in alternative care, children who are looked after, are about 1.5% of the population, or 15,000, and that's about nearly as high a percentage as about 30 years ago. And in that statistic, in that number, includes children who are looked after at home, as well as those who are actually taken out of the home and living in alternative care. We're fortunate to have to enjoy some strong political will in relation to children in Scotland. Let me give you an example of this commitment. The Scottish Government's worked recently to define the top outcomes that it is seeking to achieve in the administration in the next Parliament, and as part of that has set out a number of outcomes and indicators paralleling really the Sustainability Development Goals in many ways. And one of the national key outcomes that is being consulted on at the moment is for children to grow up loved, safe, and respected so that they reach their full potential. Some of the specific ways in which this is played out in terms of the political will are the drivers towards, in a social policy context, improving the educational outcomes for children who are in alternative care. There's been a major policy priority in recent years. related to their educational outcomes, as well as a major push to allow children to stay in the care system for some form of supported care until the age of 25, which is called the Staying Put agenda. And another really important trend that's been happening in the last few years in Scotland is the very important voice of young people with experience of the care system and the power of their advocacy to begin to shape our understanding about our systems to be more about relationships and relational rather than about the systems and processes alone. And then finally, a quick picture of the legislative sort of structural basis of social work in children and families. In Scotland, social workers have a strong mandate to intervene in family life to protect children from neglect and abuse. However, they're also mandated to work in partnership with parents and to seek to preserve family life as far as is compatible with the protection of children. So parents retain many of their parental rights, even when children are separated in alternative care. There's a strong statutory framework around standards for social work, independent inspection and monitoring of services, and social work is a protected title and requires a 4-year degree. And finally, just in terms of poverty, we still struggle with issues of poverty. It's not a reason that children are admitted to alternative care purely, but in reality, the great majority of the families whose children are coming into care are dealing with we're dealing with the most poorest sectors of our population. And so where children are removed, they are usually from families where there is poverty plus issues of family breakdown and stress, mental health or addictions issues, domestic violence, and the like. And so, so many really valuable lessons from our colleagues in Uganda from this morning, but the parallel of the importance of all the systems working towards improving outcomes for children is certainly echoed for us in Scotland. So I'd like to hand things over to Iona with the clicker.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And we'll hear from Iona now.
Good morning, everybody. It's really good to be here in Washington today. And I thought I had done, we come from a country where it's cold and wet and rainy most of the time, hence we dress in grey. But also, I thought I'd done quite well. I would dress for the Washington weather, but I forgot about the air conditioning. So, don't know about you, but I'm freezing. I'm going to talk today about the work we're doing on the workforce to do with social services. So that's about paraprofessional social care workers and about qualified social workers. And to do that, I'll give you a small bit of context around, a bit too much context there, around how we practice social work in Scotland. And Jennifer's just mentioned some of that. Now, there you go. That's a picture of the Isle of Harris, which I took in the summer. That's the summer, by the way, last year. But beautiful, stunning. And I would encourage you all to visit the Isle of Harris in the northwest of Scotland. The Social Work Scotland Act in 1960 introduced the formal role of social workers in Scotland. Before that, we had social workers who were kind of in diverse pockets. So they worked in prisons, in probation, they worked in mental health institutions and psychiatry, they worked in general hospitals, or they worked in children and family welfare units. In 1968, we passed legislation which enshrined the role of social work, but most importantly actually meant that we enshrined the welfare principle in terms of children. So children were no longer treated as deviants or criminals, which they were in large numbers before 68, but they were treated as in need. And a system was introduced called the Children's Hearing Scotland system, which actually replaced the court system to deal with children who were basically in trouble or troubled. We also then saw the establishment of, I suppose, really state intervention in family life, which, as Jennifer says, is fairly highly regulated, both in terms of what we can and what we can't do, and a constant debate around the role of social workers and where they should and should not intervene. We have a Social Work Services Strategic Forum, which is chaired by a minister from the government, Marie Todd, who is the Minister for Children and Early Years, but has an overall view of the totality of the workforce of social care and social work. And we develop really a number of shared strategies, and the one that we're looking at just now is the National Health and Social Care Workforce. Social work is very much part of the health and social care professions, and in childcare works alongside justice, particularly the police and education. So we're operating and practicing in multidisciplinary team contexts, but trying to make sure that social workers have what they need in order to deliver better outcomes for children. We have a National Health and Social Care Workforce Plan and a vision. That's the landscape in terms of the numbers of social workers and where social workers work. So 32 local authorities in the main are responsible for delivering social services across Scotland. Social service workforce of around just over 200,000 and includes 5,283 social workers, most of whom work in local authorities who carry the statutory responsibility to intervene in families. And you'll see from the graph that from the pie chart that we have a mixed economy in terms of delivery. So the public sector does the stuff that is regulated, that is about statute, which is about intervening, and the voluntary sector provides services on a more partnership basis. We all work in partnership to deliver this landscape, and the private sector is very much about the delivery of older people's services. So you can see there where the largest areas of service provision are, and particularly around care at home for adults. We regulate our workforce through the work of the Scottish Social Services Council. And the Scottish Social Services Council is an arm's-length organisation funded entirely by government and by the fees that they raise from social workers and social care workers. And I am the sponsoring agency for the social services workforce. The role of the SSSC includes the registration of the workforce. So that's the professional workforce, so that's for social workers, but also for social care workers and for support workers across a very varied number of categories. We set standards for conduct and behaviour, and we have a national standard document, and they regulate the fitness to practice. For social workers or social care workers who violate their standards or who are subject to disciplinary action by their employer will be referred to the council, and they too will decide whether or not somebody should be able to continue to practice. And they are also responsible for the workforce development. And in that, they link directly to the education sector as well. And a number of questions this morning about training and qualifications. SSSC have the authority to work with the universities to approve their degree courses. To be a social worker, you need to have a degree. And most of our social care workers have vocational qualifications. We also have a quality assurance system which is enshrined in statute as well, and where we established the Care Inspectorate. And the Care Inspectorate have powers to intervene, particularly in regulated services. So that's services like daycare, like residential care for children, which Ian's going to talk about, or residential care for older people. So that we have that kind of quality assurance via an inspection agency who can turn up anywhere, whenever they like, but regularly inspect in relation to leadership and system-wide leadership and system-wide responses. We also have at each locality a chief social work officer who has regulated responsibilities and requires to report to the elected members within their authority and on a national basis, on a regular basis, about how that authority is performing in relation to statute. We're here today really to talk about the National Workforce Plan for Health and Social Care. We published it at Christmas time, just before Christmas. It covers the whole of the health and social care workforce, and we have three parts to it. The first part of the workforce plan was about our acute hospital care. The second part is about social services, and the third part is about what we call in Scotland primary care, which is about community care and generally relates to doctors and nurses and allied health professions. So this is the first time we've had a national workforce plan, and we are trying to pull together the learning that we have across health and social care. A piece of legislation that's really recently been passed in Scotland in 2014 saw the integration of health and social care around the provision of services to adults. And that's where this work has come from. It's a national approach, but it's in partnership. Given the pie chart I put up earlier, which showed you where people work, clearly we need to do this in partnership. As the Scottish Government, we lead very clearly in the health workforce, which is a national workforce which is regulated directly by the government. For this workforce in social care, it's a local government or a non-government organisation workforce, and therefore we need to do this together. And I jointly chair this along with a colleague from the local government side. So we work with the employers and with the non-government organisations, most of whom are funded by local government, to look at what we need to do in order to have a better approach to workforce planning for social work and social care in the future. We know that the demand for social care in particular will escalate very much in the next 20 to 25 years, and that's without changing our models of care. And one of the things we're looking at across the piece is how do we change models of care in order to meet the growing demand in elderly care, but also to meet the different approaches that we would like to see in childcare and family care and in justice services as well. And that's really why we've come to this approach around a national health and social care workforce plan. And wherever we can, we are looking at the evidence around practice, the evidence about what works and what we need to do in the future. And a number of people have asked about things like supervision and support, and that's part of what we want to look at as well. But we're also establishing a partnership, a formal partnership with the universities across Scotland who deliver the training. And we met for the first time on Friday, and we're going to establish that as a national partnership, which will then look at how we provide training places, how we provide opportunities for social work students to learn, and how we translate that into the requirements of employers. So these are the recommendations. So we worked together to, at Christmas, publish a document which we agreed with local government and with the non-government sector about the things that we need to do. And that's about, we talked this morning about integrated workforce data. This is about how do we provide that data back in order to be able to look at what's needed and what we need in terms of future workforce. We are looking at national and local labour market workforce analysis, because one of the challenges for us is, will we have enough people to work in this area in the future? We're looking at guidance for partnerships, and the partnerships are the delivery organisation at a local level, and looking at how we bring agencies together, how we bring partnerships together to actually deliver on the front line for people. And the part of our legislation is very much about the delivery of our services is to be seamless from the point of view of those who use them. We're also looking at how we promote social care as a career, and the qualifications that are required for it coming up, and looking at opportunities for paraprofessionals to also train to become social workers or nurses or teachers, in fact, and developing career pathways. And we're looking at training and education opportunities for social workers to develop advanced practice with particular interest around mental health, around children and families and child protection, and around justice. And we're working alongside the people who deliver on the front line, as well as their employers and the universities and our colleagues in the improvement side of the House in Celsius to deliver on this agenda. And over the next 12 to 24 months, we will deliver a number of outcomes in relation to these streams of work. And of course, at that point, I'd be very happy to come back and talk to you about the outcomes. Thank you.
Greetings, colleagues. Greetings to those of you in the room and those of you on the web in your offices. It's good to be here, and as I think the slide shows, I'm here to talk about our residential childcare workforce and some of the development that has happened. I need to give you some of the context as well as bits about the training or development, and I'm also going to be illustrating some of the continuing challenges and where we are at today. So it was quite complicated. I'll go through some of it quickly just to give you some facts. And in this audience, I think you'll make sense of these. We deinstitutionalized our system 30 to 40 years ago and focused more efforts on prevention and also more efforts on extending foster care and improving its quality, and in reducing the size of the residential sector and the size of homes. And what we've now got, at any one point in time, around 1,500 children in various forms of residential care, 14% of the total number, the figure that Jennifer gave earlier on. The great majority of the children in residential care, as you might expect, are teenagers, those over 11, although some specialist services for younger children. We also include children with disabilities in these figures, and there's almost none of them in long-term care in Scotland. The great majority who receive these kind of services get it on a short-term respite basis, and there are very few specialist residential schools. So let's move on quickly. When we talk about residential care, we're meaning small group homes, 3 to 8 children usually, handful of residential special schools, Monday to Friday kind of thing, mostly, and a small number of secure care homes, which do cater for a very small number of children who are convicted of very serious offences under the age of 18, but also short-term placements for children who are at severe risk to themselves, not involved in criminal activity. Okay. Now, this slide has got quite a lot of information on it on the next two, and I'm just going to pick out a few factors. That our residential care is provided by a mixture of local authorities, NGOs and privates. We currently we register 7,000 staff. They all have to possess qualifications or be working towards them. The current group who are considered fully qualified is about 60%. Residential care acts, as I've already said, as a specialist service and a kind of a safety net for foster care, you might say. The point that I'm really picking out here is that we've had a government commitment to the sector, and the official policy position is that residential care is a positive choice. So that's the official policy position. We didn't want to use the words of last resort, although probably in practice it's kind of like last resort, but we feel that children shouldn't ever be able to feel that they are the last resort or that the staff are the last resort. Anyway, we've had many initiatives over the years, and about 15, 20 years ago, a new initiative was launched by the government to provide resources and training to the sector. And that was under the auspices of a newly created body called the Scottish Institute for Residential Childcare. Okay, again, some brief pointers for a lot of material here. What has shaped this world in which the training is coming into? Well, one sad but utterly real issue is the issue of historical abuse by some staff of the children in their care. And the challenge with that was that where it wasn't spotted, it wasn't seen by others, sometimes physical abuse that was allowed to pass unmonitored by managers, sometimes sexual abuse happening in secret. But we also missed the children talking to us and telling us. We missed their voices, we didn't listen properly, and we didn't give them the responses they needed when they began to tell us. So what has the impact of all that? Well, it tells us we need to improve our standards and focus on preventing abuse, of course, and to do so to do so robustly and with confidence. And to support all that, we've got rigorous independent inspection that's already been mentioned. Some countries call it monitoring, and based on written national care standards to try to standardise at a high level the quality of care. we've already begun to mention this business of the registration of staff, compulsory registration, which, as well as regulating people, offers career opportunities because we have increasing training and we have requirements to be registered. And the key thing is that to be registered, you need to have a certain qualification. Jennifer's already mentioned at the beginning that across our sector, there has been an increasingly strong requirement that we listen directly to the voices of children in decisions about their care. So we call that sometimes advocacy and sometimes participation, and that's a really big part of our scene. But we've also felt the need to remind ourselves that it's okay to give children hugs when staff are worried about being accused of abuse and all kinds of things. Then even the basics of care sometimes get brought into question. So we've been working hard to make sure that our care is still loving, caring, nurturing. Okay, so that's given you a whistle-stop tour of a lot of big issues. What did the government do? Well, it said that we need to fund over a period of years. We've had a 10-plus year programme focused on these residential workers of all grades, managers and middle, senior supervisors and basic grade. And it was a partnership organisation of training institutions, universities, colleges, and an NGO. And a whole number of specialist social care or adapted social work courses were devised at different academic levels. And training routes were for existing staff as well as some new staff. So therefore, the mode of training was part-time, distance learning, day release, etc. But this institute also was expected to build and maintain morale amongst the workforce. And so bringing people together in seminars and conferences was part of it, and the development of relevant training materials and online resources. As we began to focus on the children's experiences, on children's outcomes, improving their outcomes, then we began to realize that we needed to address the training needs as we saw them of education staff, teachers, and health workers. And so this institute focused on trying to engage with these other professions to improve what they could do for the children in care. So, just to come to the last bullet point, that currently there is a proposal all residential workers be required to have a higher level of qualification, to upgrade from a kind of sub-university degree qualification at the moment to a university degree level. And that's been strongly influenced by learning from the social work tradition of social pedagogy, which I'm going to mention in a minute. So that was the government's commitment. And many courses and training opportunities were provided aimed really at covering the whole workforce. The training consisted sometimes of college-based courses, as I've mentioned, but I should also mention that we developed a strong form of in-service training, certified training called vocational qualifications at different levels, from quite a low level, basic grade level, but to managerial levels. So our residential workers have training in, if you like, college-based type training, but also vocational training, workplace-based training, which is assessed and certified. So quite a complex picture. Okay, I'm keeping moving on. So we're now looking at the context again of all this training. You begin to get a picture, I hope, that there's been tons of training going on for residential workers, and yet we've been recovering from this whole issue of a whole number of historic abuse cases, sometimes far in the past, sometimes not so far in the past. So we've got this strong monitoring and audit culture. Staff can become defensive and fearful. So we need to keep focusing on the children. Their rights to quality care means avoiding sterile care and promoting caring nurture. So how do you train people to provide really professional, accountable care that's also very loving and giving and heartfelt and based on genuine relationships? And so residential workers and educators such as myself felt that our traditions in social work were a little bit weak in some ways, and that we've looked to what are sometimes seen as other professions, although they're really just sister professions of social work, That's child and youth care and social pedagogy. Child and youth care is established in Canada and South Africa, and a little bit in the USA, and it's a way of training to degree level workers to work with children in different settings. Social pedagogy is a long-established European form of social work from Western and Central Europe. So the reason that we've been drawn to them, and we're beginning to draw on those traditions and those knowledge bases and skill sets, is because we've had to find a way to accommodate workers who have both the professional and the personal skills to provide really good quality care where people live. And so what we're seeing now in Scotland is the emergence, and across the UK actually it's the same, of a Scottish and UK social pedagogy. And it would be crazy to really try to summarise social pedagogy, but I'm giving a few bullet points here. Social pedagogues focus on child's holistic development and their social integration. There's a liberationist element in social pedagogy about advocating for children to receive their full rights in society, not just to overcome personal or family problems. Importantly, social pedagogy is a head, hands and heart profession. The head, you are required to think, to reflect on the theories and the ideas and the concepts around child development and family life and social challenges, but you're also expected to be somewhat practical. So pedagogues do things with children, activities, outdoor and crafts and all kinds of things, and do them thoughtfully and reflectively. And that's where it's a little bit different from social work generally in terms of the training. But it's also this business I've been alluding to of a heart, that we retain our private life. So social pedagogues have a private life that they don't bring to work, but they bring their personal life to work, their personal skills, their personal qualities, because it's that relationship building that we're looking for. So that is what we're seeing in that tradition, and we also see it in child and youth care. And so we're integrating that gradually and slowly into some of our training and into our program designs. And a couple of other points about that social pedagogic issue. I've been mentioning the use of play and activities, but also pedagogues work much more comfortably with groups, whether it's groups of children and young people, groups of people with perhaps drug issues, but also the community. So the pedagogues are people who engage in community work, in group work, as well as in individual work, and are trained and equipped to do that, working alongside people. And a different kind of casework emphasis. Social pedagogues don't generally have the same emphasis on casework, although they, of course, can work with individuals on a program basis. So that's where we're going. We feel that we've been on a journey in the cliche. We've been training people. We've been providing lots of training. We've been focusing on outcomes. But we haven't got to the full quality that we want to have. We haven't got the flexibility, the interprofessional shared languages, but we're working on it. And we certainly feel that going in this direction will help us. I just want to finish by saying that the reason we have to keep going, and I'll finish, being a good academic, I'll give you some references, and you can follow up any of this stuff up at your own leisure. But expectations are rising of what children should expect, about their rights to quality of care, their rights to be connected to families, maybe their birth families, even if they can't live with them, or perhaps with new families. But the workforce needs to be able to work closely with families, with painful, difficult issues, but with a rights-based focus. And that's what we aspire to, and that's what we're looking our new waves and our next stages of professional development to be focused on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. So I'd like to pick up from where Ian's left off in terms of that journey, if I may. So Ian's told you about a big sort of push, really a good news story in Scotland of how we've managed to reach minimum qualifications for residential childcare staff. Really a decade-long change program between about 2002 and 2012 when that concluded. And it was supported indeed by a centre that was providing workforce strengthening through training, technical assistance, and the research, as well as policy advice. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the learning journey from the perspective of that centre. And really, I think it's a story of our learning. Indeed, it's a story of our dissatisfaction of what we were achieving ultimately for children who were in alternative care. Because we really wanted to see them having the best possible opportunities in life, the best care and the best support. And it's a story that continues to unfold, so it doesn't have there's not an ending to what I share, but I do share this with you because I think the learning has some real resonances to some of the particular moments we see of opportunity for children globally. For example, in the way in which the global partnerships inspire and strategies may be taken forward, and the way in which the UNICEF strategy may be taking forward its workforce strengthening arm. So with that, let me just say to you that what I'll be speaking with is really taking us from the macro that Iona was giving us, the macro picture, really through to looking at the micro of effective transference of information to the skill, to changed skills at a practice level. And the context I'd like to share this with you is in the context of a multi-sectoral partnership at a very local level, with the focus starting on children's outcomes. So what is it we really want to be able to see as a result of responding well to children in adversity, for example? Because ultimately what we want to do is close the implementation gap, and this requires some additional pieces in our workforce strengthening efforts that we had been previously undertaking. Specifically, I'll be talking through support for implementation in practice to really make things happen most effectively, the whole systems being aligned to achieve outcomes we're striving for, and the importance that we found of starting small and getting better. So through the workforce strengthening efforts we've undertaken, I want to share with you just a further thought about the gap that we were seeing in that effort of 10 years of training staff and ensuring that they had qualifications. Staff were coming out of their local areas where they were then learning and coming back to their workplaces. And what we saw was it was very difficult sometimes for workers to be able to actually apply their learning in the context of the culture of the place that they were working. So they had gained a lot of knowledge, but they weren't really able to apply it in practice, sometimes because of the culture being quite different, sometimes because the manager may have felt threatened by this new knowledge. But ultimately, we kept seeing this implementation gap of where we weren't really satisfied that just training and qualifications alone would really be able to shift what we were looking for in terms of really improved practice. And our workforce strengthening efforts were clearly essential. People needed that knowledge, but it just wasn't sufficient. And so it's really given us a drive to understand what would be sufficient and what could be done. And it's interesting that in our dissatisfaction, as that was emerging for us and we were realizing that knowledge wasn't really effectively transferring as fully as we would have liked, that was also emerging in the literature about what helps changed practice on the ground, and what the very robust meta-analysis of implementation efforts has shown that the kinds of things we've always drawn on as instinctively as things that will make change happen, actually, if they're taken alone at any one of these, are insufficient to make substantial change. And so if we implement a legislation or law we create, that alone will not make the practice change. It's essential, but it's not sufficient. Funding and incentives are really important. Implementation, but without actually changing the roles that people are playing, will not get us where we want to get to. Giving information, putting them passively on a website will be important, but it won't get us to where we need to get to. And indeed, training alone will not get us where we need to get to. And that no matter how well done, we're really seeing in the data that the amount of actual change and the power of these individual pieces are not getting us where we need to get to. So we began to look much more closely at our mechanisms for stronger and more effective workforce strengthening of the development beyond just training and qualifications. And from letting things happen, where getting good ideas out there that are compelling, the sort of advocacy work is important, but when it's coming to thinking about how people are working directly with children and young people and their families, when we're talking about routine practice change, where people are saying and doing things differently, just letting things happen won't get us there. CIRC was helping things happen. Many of the different pieces that CIRC is the Scottish Institute for Residential Childcare that Ian was talking about, the centre that was working on that decade-long change programme. CIRC was working very hard to help things happen, and those were important activities, setting out expectations, setting out the minimum qualifications. There was a national plan for how that was to happen. There was a sharing of evidence and knowledge. There was through the training and qualifications, people were exposed to those expectations, and that was really important. However, we assumed that if people knew something, it would be enough to actually make them be saying and doing things different and practice. And that, I think, is where, on reflection, we missed a trick. And we were helping it happen, but we weren't necessarily bringing the change to the ground. And what we really want to see is, how do we actually make things happen? And the additional piece in all of that is that it requires not just the knowledge, but requires intentional supports within the practice settings to shift the practice in a meaningful and in a sustained way. So as we began to explore this further, we looked more closely at the ways in which the workforce can be supported really intentionally and we looked more closely into the science and practice of implementation. One of the areas that we were quite keen to look more closely at and have been looking and applying has been understanding the drivers of implementation in the context of workforce strengthening. And so I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here, but what I do want to say, because I can very gladly talk about this on the margins of our meeting today, if that would be useful. And there's certainly references I'd recommend if you're interested to look more closely at. We've begun to look at some of the key areas in our workforce strengthening methods, specifically on three axes, if you will, although I realize this is a triangle, it doesn't have an axis, but on the left-hand side of the triangle, what we're looking at is around the workforce, not just understanding the training, but beginning to ask questions about how are we selecting staff in the first place, and are they the right kinds of staff to deliver the kinds of roles that we need them to do? And the actual changed practice mechanism for us has been looking at how do we strengthen the coaching, become really clear about what we're looking for in the changed practice, and incorporate coaching much more intentionally in our efforts to change practice. On the organizational drivers, we've been looking much more closely at how we understand data and the importance of data driving not just data at the national level in terms of trends, but meaningful data that tells us, are we doing what we need to do today? And if not, what do we need to do tomorrow to ensure that we can help improve even further the experience of that child, specifically for the outcome that we're working towards? So some of the examples in which we're doing some of this work, I'll give you a brief example. In Scotland, there's a newly legislative role for earlier intervention that allows for a single point of contact for families to access if they're concerned about something that's happening in their family with their child. And the responsibility to be that single point of contact is now the responsibility of people who aren't normally facilitating conversations with families about struggles. And so those staff, early year staff, teachers, are grappling with this new role of what it means to engage with a family around something that might be concerning them. And so we're working very closely to help them think through what exactly does that role look like, and how can we support them to deliver on that more effectively. And while I'm talking about practice, I do want to acknowledge that the practice requires then the systems and services to be reinforcing the strength of that practice. And that's where the leadership drivers also are essential in this. What we find is that the leadership function to ensure that the good practice is consistent and sustained requires very clear definitions of what that role of that leadership ought to be at every level of the system. And so as we've been talking about every level of the system, let me just speak for a moment about this. You may have noticed that I was just speaking about an example that is about earlier intervention and helping to support families long before anything becomes a crisis, so that social work intervention isn't needed. That's no longer just a residential childcare example. And indeed, what we recognized at CIRC was that a focus just on workforce practice in one setting alone in a child's lifetime was not going to be sufficient to really change the outcomes for those children. And we were learning that, for example, that if we had fantastic residential childcare services, but we hadn't done care planning very effectively in advance of that, hadn't supported the family in advance of that. Or perhaps as the child left, the young person leaves the care environment, if they're then sort of abandoned to have to manage on their own without the kinds of supports they need across a whole system, we weren't supporting children well enough to really be able to achieve their full potential. And so in the context of that, the role that CERC was playing at the time has been then adapted and changed, and the Scottish Government had asked us to become CELSIS, which is the Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children, which took on board the entire journey of a child through alternative care and indeed in advance of them needing to come into the care system, with the recognition that all of these levels need to be aligned to the outcome we're trying to achieve for that child. And without that alignment, we're not going to get to where we need to be. And I think we heard from Lydia this morning already about the importance of those levels. So our journey at CELSIS has been happening as we've been embracing nationally a whole process of thinking in terms of how do we make change happen across our work. So I've spoken about some of the work in earlier intervention and in residential childcare, but actually this kind of thinking has been much more a part of our understanding nationally about how do we make change happen. So we have something called the Child and Young Persons Improvement Collaboratives that are looking at specific areas in which we might be able to make improvements for children where we know that needs to happen. And I suppose this has been really important for us to be thinking how we go about our projects. And one of the key learning pieces from this is the importance of starting small and then getting better. Starting small, being really closely attentive to are we getting the outcomes we're looking to achieve, and then beginning to scale up across more widely when we've managed to get the changes that we're looking for in practice. And so can I come back to that question about what are the missing pieces? So if we're wanting to strengthen the workforce, to close the implementation gap right through to understanding how will children's outcomes genuinely be improved, then we're looking at support for implementation in practice across all the skills of staff, across meaningful data, and strengthened by leadership. We're also looking at whole systems being aligned towards the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And we understand the importance of being able to start small and to get better. If you'd like to be in touch with me or any of us about the work that we've been doing, please do be in touch. The CELSIS story does continue because just last year we launched the Inspiring Children's Futures Institute, which is bringing together the applied centers of learning around the work of CELSIS and other centers in the university to be able to work more closely and more preventatively even further in order to achieve the outcomes we're looking for children. Thank you for your interest today. Now I switch to my role as chair, and we have some time for questions, and you'd be more than welcome to ask anything you may like to ask. So there's a question back here, and then just one over here. Thank you.
Yes, John Williamson, USAID Displaced Children and Orphans Fund. I was a bit surprised that Scotland is, although I had heard this, still somewhat reliant on residential care for children. And I had three related questions. On what basis is a decision made that is in a child's or adolescent's best interests to be placed in residential care rather than in a family setting? Regarding respite care, what is an average or typical duration? How long might a child with a disability be in residential care? And the special schools, what sorts of disabilities would lead to a child being placed in a special school as opposed to an inclusive school?
Should we take a few questions and then come around? There was a question at this table over here before, and then over to Aaron.
Thank you very much. I'm Samson Kironde from University Research Company. And the question I had was concerning the first presentation, where I think it was Iona who mentioned that up to 30% of the social service workers that you're working with in Scotland are volunteers. Basically, they do voluntary work. And I just wanted to understand exactly what this means in the Scottish context, because I'm involved in some work trying to assess what social service workers and other community health workers do in a couple of countries in Africa. And to them, voluntarism means that
We can hear you.
yeah, they're not paid. They don't get any type of remuneration. Maybe they may get a transport stipend or something of that sort, or some non-monetary benefits for the work that they do. But then what happens is that the level of attrition is really very high. After a couple of years or so, you had 100 of these volunteers. You now only have 20, and sustainability therefore becomes a problem. And in the same vein, even those programs that do pay these community health workers, one of the challenges that they do have is that sustainability becomes a problem, because many of the funds that they utilize to pay either social service workers or other community health workers are from donor-funded initiatives. And when these end, obviously, governments often cannot take over that burden, and therefore the programs collapse. So I just really wanted to understand what voluntarism means in this sense that you were discussing it. Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll take Aaron's question.
Hi, Aaron Greenberg. I'm the regional advisor for UNICEF on child protection in Europe and Central Asia. And we're struggling now in Europe and Central Asia. I have a million questions, but two in specific. One is there's a wave of deinstitutionalization happening across the region, which is continuing over the past 10 years. And there's been an over-reliance in many people's perspective on the development of small group homes and smaller residential care facilities in that process. I, for one, believe that there is a transitionary period at play in which the reduction of those types of small group homes and care facilities will decline over time. And we're already seeing that in some countries. But the numbers of children in these facilities, the characteristics of the facilities are hotly debated, with 15, 18 being characterized as small group home or small residential care. And I saw that 3 to 8 looks like the number that in Scotland, at least, you're looking to cap it at. But I did see that number grows in certain circumstances. And is that a debate in Scotland in terms of the numbers and how many is appropriate, including for children who may have committed grave crimes and are now in residential care facilities of 18 plus? I mean, these are just questions that I would just love for you to reflect on a little bit. And then the role of boarding schools. This is another very sensitive area in Central and Eastern Europe. In terms of recharacterizing institutional care facilities as boarding schools, essentially just saying no, they're not institutional care facilities, they're boarding schools, and then inserting some teachers there and trying to do better in terms of providing schooling. But can you talk about the role of assessing boarding schools, and what is a boarding school and what is a residential care facility, and how you make those determinations in Scotland, or just any reflections around that would be useful.
Great, thank you. Ian, would you like to begin with responding to? Do we have? So online, our online friends. Thank you, Nicole. Why don't we take the question here from online and then?
Sure. We have a few questions. For starters, for those of us watching in other countries who are looking at jointly developing and implementing a workforce development plan, what recommendations do you have based on what you've learned in this process? And then the other question is along the lines of psychosocial needs of children in childcare, and how do you address those psychosocial needs, and what training is being developed for providing psychosocial support?
Thank you. Ian, would you like to come in with our first and third question, I think, perhaps?
Okay, let me try and pick up some of the questions about the use of residential care. I think there's many points that we could make. John's got a huge amount of experience in this area, and one of the things is that we have to attend to children's rights. And one of the things is that when you move to a lot of children in foster care, then often you get placement breakdowns. And in this country and in our country, that has been a real challenge to us. And one of the things we see is that when teenagers have been through some foster placements, they often express a preference for small group care. And so one of the reasons it happens is because we try to at least take into account children's views as expressed by them. So our country, like every country, has some residential care. And as I say, it's a relatively small proportion, and the homes are relatively small. Maybe just a first point about that. Specific points about respite care. We have a highly variegated pattern, and obviously the children who are priority for the respite care places, which are funded by the local authority, are usually those who have the most quite high complex needs, as I think we would say in some sectors, multiple disabilities, and where the family's under strain. So people sometimes get a pattern of one weekend every 3 months, for example, or perhaps a week, 4 or 5 days every 3 months. Some people might get 1 week in the summer. Some people might get a few days. Others might get on an emergency basis. So I think what we might correctly characterize as quite short-term, but sometimes planned periods of respite care. And I should say that we had a lot of debates internally in the country about what the name should be, and I think respite is probably a technically correct term that I used here, but of course, from the children's rights perspective, people are saying, well, okay, is that what our parents have to get respite from us? What are we getting out of it? So we have moved to the whole notion of short break service, and we're trying to make a really positive experience for children that they get a good short break, and their parents get the respite from the caring duties, but the children get their rights to quality care upheld. Residential schools, special schools, you've been mentioned about. Some countries are extremely, if I can take the kind of Canadas and other countries where there's been whole use of residential schools in decades past to undermine the very rights and identity of Aboriginal people, First Nations people, then I truly understand it. We haven't had exactly that situation in Scotland, but we have still retreated from the use of them very considerably. So they are very small. Again, I would say on the disability side, it's usually children who have extremely complex needs, multiple forms of disability. And we might have one school that has evolved from the old blind school, which now serves a much smaller group of children who have indeed got visual impairments plus other disabilities, usually learning disabilities, autism spectrum, and so on and so forth. So some of the schools are about disability. There are a small number of children who are behaviorally disturbed, might be considered the children coming in through the welfare route, not because of a recognized disability. And again, we just find it a very effective way of working with some very small, but usually very deeply troubled children who, as they have usually been through multiple fostering placement breakdowns. So I hope that answers at least some of that.
I'm going to suggest just 2 thoughts further for Aaron's question, if I can come in and bring the 2 residential childcare questions together. Just very specifically, yes, we have grappled with the thinking about what does small-scale group care look like? What does it mean? Where is its valid place? I think that, to be fair, we've had some conclusions that it will be the positive placement of choice for the children for whose needs it meets. And so there's a really careful assessment of where will children be best served. And I'm saying children, I really do mean young people, because predominantly it's young people. I think in the question about what you're describing and the challenges of how we understand deinstitutionalization and the place of small group care, there is a question that I think is really critical, which is thinking through what is the function of that. So what is the damage of when it's really poorly managed. And so what would good quality small group care look like? It would need to be close to families. It would need need to be able to facilitate engagement with family. It would need to be engaging with schools in the community. It would need to be part of the community. So all the elements of harmful institutions, I think, we need to immediately be considering to make sure we're not just replicating a harmful institution in a very small way. So these cannot be institutionalized places. These need to be homes for children and young people. And sometimes I think we get caught up with the size but actually it needs to be the function and the experience of the child in that environment that defines whether this is the kind of quality care that that the UN guidelines for alternative care would find acceptable and that we would all find acceptable for children. I'm happy to talk further with anyone about some of this, but I'm mindful of time, and I'm going to suggest we turn to the second question and ask Iona to address that.
Okay. Sorry, I don't think I was very clear in the presentation. When we talk about voluntary staff, they are people who work for voluntary organisations, but they are paid. So it's different to volunteers. We do have volunteers working in Scotland. I suppose the area where there are the most volunteers working in Scotland with children is in fact the children's hearing system, which is the alternative to court for children, which determines where children are cared for and whether or not compulsory measures of care need to be taken. And all of those people are volunteers and they're trained and supported on a voluntary capacity. But most of the people who work in what we've called there the voluntary sector are paid, but they work for non-government organisations. And therefore they don't discharge the same statutory responsibilities as others. But I think the issue that you mentioned and that another colleague mentioned about sustainability is really important, because I think you talked about, particularly in the voluntary sector, the non-government sector, there's often a feeling of they recruit people, they train them, and then something happens in terms of an employment drive and everybody moves to work for the local government sector, and the non-government sector has to start all over again in terms of recruitment and training and employment. And that's one of the things we want to achieve with our national approach to the workforce plan, is that is done on a local basis with all of the organisations. So when we produce a local, and this was my job up until about a year ago, when we produce a local plan for the workforce for delivery of our strategic plans, that includes the non-government organisations and the private organisations, as well as the government and health organisations, so that we stop doing the things that we do in terms of robbing each other around the staff and retaining staff. To do that has been complex, and the government has had to fund significantly a living wage, what we call in Scotland the Scottish living wage approach, particularly within the residential sector, where we have given non-government organisations money in order to raise the living wage of those who work within the sector. So it's cost quite a lot of money. There's probably still not enough money in there. And I have no doubt in the work that we continue to do in the workforce plan, we will identify areas where we need further investment. But this is one of the big problems that we've had, particularly with nurses working in the residential, the elderly residential sector. There's been a real issue. So that's how we plan to tackle it. And we have a basis to do that because we have this legislation which requires each area to establish these partnerships. I think the thing about the jointly developing a workforce plan is actually to understand what we all bring to the table, and to develop a genuine joint leadership approach to that is really important. And if we don't do that, then it won't work in the end of the day. Jennifer talked about implementation and the issues that we have around implementation, and that's very much about, if we're not truly committed to it in terms of the partnership, then we won't be able to actually achieve what we need to achieve. And that means good inspirational leadership from the public sector, the non-government sector, and supported by others in order to deliver that. And I think that's one of the key things. And we see quite often in Scotland some stress around that, strain, because the health service, and we have a national health service which is free at the point of delivery with a national workforce, is very pushy in many ways and wants to get on and wants everything done its way. So there's a real tension in that because of the different players. But it's really important that the employers are part of this approach. Otherwise, I don't think it will work.
There was a question that about the for those in other countries who are looking at jointly developing and implementing a workforce development plan. This was from online. What recommendations do you have based on what you have learned from this process? So I'm going to look to the panel to see what thoughts they have. I think you won't be surprised to hear me say that in answer to that question, there's real importance for us to be thinking about how are we going to make the change all the way through to the micro level of change practice. And let's not think that because we've got something in place in a local area and everyone knows what we ought to be doing, that means we necessarily will do it. So the question, I think, for me that I would continue to come back to us to be asking is, what are we asking people to say and do differently? And is that well understood? And are there structures in places that are there people around them to help coach them to ensure that they're getting to that place of consistently and sustainably saying and doing those things differently? Do you want to come in with any other thoughts you had about the answers to that?
I've got one piece based partly on my experience traveling in different places. What we've been talking about in Scotland, all the different organisations and the people who deliver services, nearly all the money comes from government. It's channeled through local governments. So that's quite different to many countries on a lower income situation or in transitions from former communist kind of systems. So what we notice, and what is very troubling and difficult to manage in the childcare situation in some countries, is that the NGOs, particularly externally funded NGOs, constitute a huge part of the system. So if the question was coming in and saying, well, how do you promote a collaborative agenda in a country like that, which is open to external funding, but which maybe happens in a pretty random way, and often NGOs, and faith-based NGOs in particular, I think it's fair to say, feel that they have a mandate. Sometimes they feel very directly they have a mandate from God, which is rather difficult to negotiate with. But we're all trying our best here, and I think we need to respect each other. But certainly for my money, that I think NGOs need to seek their value in alignment with their value base, of course. But that needs to have some kind of adherence to the local laws, to the government, giving the government its place of respect, as we heard our Ugandan colleagues talking about earlier on. Because ultimately, I think the kinds of directions of travel that's being talked about in this room and in our country is hugely dependent on the government being perceived and acting as the duty bearer, the principal duty bearer, and people then coming in to support and strengthen the government, but also to act in alignment with government policies. Now, that doesn't mean to say that NGOs can't continue to be radical and occasionally rebellious and propose different contributions that they wish to make. But really, if they're providing a core social service, it has to be in alignment with government policies, I believe. And so therefore, I think this issue of collaboration, where there's stakeholders who are externally funded, I believe is one of our key challenges in child welfare. And there are a whole number of organisations that are really looking at what is now being called donor education and donor advocacy, because we cannot have Western donors in countries which have long given up institutional forms of care, continually funding into other countries institutional forms of care that are not in any way connected to other services or other systems. So I do think that's a big challenge in some countries that needs to be taken on board for the kind of collaborative developments that we all need to see.
Iona, did you want to come in on that question?
No, I think just Ian's covered most of it. I really think it is about collaboration and it's about clarity of role. And I suppose that is the problem that often we find, is that there's confusion of role. And yeah, I absolutely accept what Ian is saying, is that in Scotland, the government plays a very clear role in that. And often we play the role of coordination as well. So it's just that clarity is really important.
And on the last question that came through from online about psychosocial needs of children in childcare, can I suggest that the references that Ian has in his PowerPoint might be a good place to look? And also there, if anyone would like to go to the celsus.org website, there will be adverts for a massive open online course, which is free, on getting care right for all children, which is based on the UN guidelines, and also a course on caring for vulnerable children, which might respond specifically to that question. And on that note, I think with time, it is my responsibility to say thank you very much to our panel and to our audience and to our online audience, and to ask Nicole to come and join us for the last instruction of what's next.